Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. Today's lecture is titled Reading Postmodern Postcolonial Fiction. Having taken a look at the intersections between postmodernism and postcolonialism, today we try to look at the fiction which is produced as part of this intersection, and in that sense predominantly we shall be looking at postcolonial fiction which uses the narrative techniques and the narrative strategies of postmodernism. While reading post-colonial fiction, it is possible to say that we usually employ two kinds of post-colonialist reading strategies. And the first one is those which tease out the colonialist assumptions in European literature. And here we will be taking a look at a text such as Mansfield Park or Jane Eyre or Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The second set is those which examine literature produced within a once colonized nation or by writers from an ethnic group within Britain and the United States. It is possible to say that it is within this second category that postmodernism tends to get evoked, because it is the second kind of literature which lends itself easily to the postmodern reading of postcolonial fiction. So, today our discussion is going to be about postmodern postcolonial fiction, such as the kind of fiction written by Marquez, Rushdie, Toni Morrison, etc. We shall be looking at one or two texts in greater detail today. And before we move into the discussion of the novel, it is important to see what exactly the intersection between postcolonialism and postmodernism suggests. One of the things which could be identified in common is the premise that the writing of history is the chief ideological means of imprisoning subjects in a subordinate social and political position. It is a moving away from this sort of an understanding of history that facilitates the reading and rereading of postcolonial and postmodernist fiction. And much of postmodern postcolonial writing is also about the playful use of history in the re-narrativization or in the retelling of the history of particular communities and nations. It is to this effect that Linda Hutcheon coined this term historiographic metafiction to talk about a certain kind of fiction in which both postmodernism and postcolonialism are engaged in a dialogue with history. This term historiographic metafiction has been particularly useful to talk about texts such as Midnight's Children, in which you find a perfect interplay of postcolonialism and postmodernism at work. The other thing is that while using the techniques of historiographic metafiction, these postmodern postcolonial texts also make use of complex and non-linear narrative structure to rewrite history. So, in today's discussion we shall be focusing on those kind of fiction which are produced from postcolonial vantage points and which also make use of the narrative techniques, the narrative strategies which postmodernism offers. So, how do we understand the working of historiographic metafiction? When we look at historiographic metafiction, we are essentially talking about postmodern as well as postcolonial writings, and both are reconstructing their relationship with a previous historical moment. For example, in the case of postmodernism, we find them responding to modernism's ahistoricism, and in the case of postcolonialism, it is a reaction against the imposed culture of an imperial power. So, just as we have seen the ways in which, the multiple ways in which postmodernism and postcolonialism intersects, here we continue to take a look at some of the works in which we can really find this intersection at work. And this also needs a clarification at this point. This does not in any way mean that we are dealing with history in a general philosophical sense. Postcolonial historiographic metafiction shows the more specific effects of history of a particular people. So, we are not talking about general metaphysical aspects about history or about the writing of history. We are focusing on the specific stories of specific communities. It could be the stories of nations, it could be the stories of ethnographic communities as well. So, to facilitate this discussion, we are looking at three texts. The first one, Midnight's Children, which is a 1980 text authored by the British Indian author Salman Rushdie. Second one, a 1987 text titled Beloved, authored by Toni Morrison, who is an American author. She has also written extensively about black female experience. And the third text is a 1972 novel titled Mumbo, authored by Ishmael, who is an African American author. So, today we shall be taking a detailed look at Midnight Children and Beloved, and we shall also be peripherally mentioning certain things about Mumbo Jumbo, which makes it postmodern and postcolonial at the same time. And I would also like to clarify at this point that much of the discussions of today's lecture is also drawn from the Cambridge Introduction to Postmodern Fiction, edited by Brian Nicol. This is a text published in 2009 and has been considered as a seminal work in understanding postmodernist writings, particularly postmodernist fiction. So, we begin looking at Rushdie's Midnight Children, which has been a celebrated text of the contemporary postmodern postcolonial period. And as we also know, Rushdie is also perhaps one of the best known faces of postcolonialism and postmodernism as far as Indian writing in English is concerned. This work had been considered exemplary in the contemporary on account of the Booker Prize that it won in 1981, and also on account of the Best of Booker Awards that it won consecutively in 1993 and later in 2008. And at various levels, Rushdie's Midnight Children is about showing that there is no single truth about India which we must figure out. So, this is against the modernist narrative of identifying a single truth, identifying a single way in which history or truth about a community can be accessed. What Rushdie's Midnight Children tells us is that there are numerous competing truths. This can also be aligned with the number of discussions that we've had right from the beginning about meta-narratives and about the number of micro-narratives that are prevalent. As one of the characters of Midnight Children himself puts it, and there are so many stories to tell, too many. I have been a swallower of lives, and to know me, just the one of me, you will have to swallow the lot as well. This is a statement made by Saleem Sinai, the protagonist of Midnight Children, and we will find that this perfectly resonates well with most of the post-colonial stories. And when we are reading Midnight Children, we also need to realize that this is not a text which needs to be read for accuracy. And it is not again easy when it comes to the story of post-colonial nation to rely too much on the ideas related to accuracy, because the reality of the post-colonial nation has been swallowed up into the historiography of its colonizers. The history of, in that context, the history of the post-colonial nation is very much dependent on the history which has been written by the colonizer, on the history which has been imagined and narrativized by the colonizer. So, when we read Midnight Children, it is also a constant reminder that the post-colonial nation does not have a history to claim for itself. That history needs to be written. That history, those memories and those stories, they need to be reclaimed from the colonizer, and they need to be re-narrativized and rewritten, especially for the post-colonial nation. There is another instance in the novel when the protagonist Saleem Sinai speaks, and I read out to you. In a country where the truth is what it is instructed to be, reality quite literally ceases to exist, so that everything becomes possible except when we are told it is the case. And maybe this was the difference between my Indian childhood and Pakistani adolescence, that in the first I was beset by an infinity of alternative realities, while in the second I was adrift, disoriented, amid an equally infinite number of falseness, unrealities and lies. Yeah. So, we do have a very fragmented sense of truth and a fragmented sense of history to begin with, and this is what the condition of the post-coloniality is all about. And here we find that this condition gets further problematized when these authors choose to use the narrative techniques and strategies of postmodernism. In the novel Midnight Children, when we try to understand who Saleem Sinai, the protagonist, is, this fragmentation of identity becomes all the more clearer. And Saleem Sinai is born to a Hindu mother and a British colonialist, but he is raised by a Muslim couple because the two babies were switched at birth by a nurse. And when is he born? He is born at the midnight hour on 15 August 2017, and he is also presented as a character who is endowed with unusual gifts, and he is also handcuffed to history in particular ways that his story eventually becomes the story of India itself. And here we also find the play of magic realism at work. To give you a sense of the narrative techniques employed in this work, I also read to you from the novel, and this is from the first chapter, the perforated sheet. I was born in the city of Bombay once upon a time. No, that won't do. There's no getting away from the date. I was born in Dr. Nalika's nursing home on August 15th, 1947. And the time matters too. Well then, at night. No, it's important to be more on the stroke of midnight, as a matter of fact. Clock hands joined palms in respectful greeting as I came. Oh, spell it out, spell it out. At the precise instant of India's arrival at independence, I tumbled forth into the world. There were gasps, and outside the window, fireworks and crowds. A few seconds later, my father broke his big toe, but Miss Accident was a mere trifle when set beside what had befallen me in that benighted moment, because thanks to the occult tyrannies of those blandly saluting clocks, I had been mysteriously handcuffed to history, my destinies indissolubly chained to those of my country. For the next 3 decades, there was to be no escape. Soothsayers had prophesied me. Newspapers celebrated my arrival. Politicos ratified my authenticity. I was left entirely without a say in the matter. I, Saleem Sinai, later variously called snot-nose, stain-face, baldy, sniffer, Buddha, and even piece of the moon, had become heavily embroiled in fate. At the best of times, a dangerous sort of involvement, and I couldn't even wipe my own nose at the time. So, this is the kind of narration that Midnight's Children introduces to us. And throughout this novel, we find this constant tussle between fact and memory. And there is an instance in the novel when Saleem Sinai, the protagonist of the novel, he admits to having made an error in chronology. For example, according to him, in my India, Gandhi will continue to die at the wrong time. So what becomes important over here is not fact, is not the accurate fact, but only the many possibilities of remembering a certain incident in many different ways. And here we are also being made to understand that it does not matter when, only that only that Gandhi died at some point. It really does not make much of a difference in the narration or in the telling of the story when he died or at what time he died. And this is also a reminder that fact and memory need not be seen as binaries. They could perhaps coexist as well. In fact, Saleem Sinai's memory may be flawed, but at least it is his memory. And this is what becomes very important in the telling of post-colonial histories and stories, because it is not important to be accurate about the telling, but what becomes decisive is the fact that the post-colonial citizen is allowed to remember, is allowed to narrate and rewrite his own story and his own history. And when we talk about Midnight's Children, it's also a portrayal of Rushdie's India. It is the India that Rushdie represents in Midnight's Children is his own India. It is a creation of a post-colonial citizen such as Rushdie. Here we also find that we can compare this creation of Rushdie's India to that of simulacrum in the Baudrillardian sense, because it also talks about a map which precedes history. In that sense, we also find it difficult to know which is real and which is created, which is a real India and which is the India created by Rushdie. So here we find a perfect interplay of the postmodernist as well as the post-colonialist techniques at work in this work, Midnight's Children. We need to continue to dwell upon the significance of memory and how it affects the different kinds of stories which are being told. In the absence of reliable histories of an oppressed or colonized people, memory becomes very, very crucial. So even if this memory is a little inaccurate, even if it is flawed, it really doesn't matter. What Midnight's Children does is to present to us an equation between memory and identity. Because what you remember also becomes your identity also becomes your identity. And as Kandi, one of the postmodernist critics would point out, memory is a chain which connects the post-colonial subject to his or her disrupted history. So memory becomes extremely important in identity formation, and we find this being made very aware through the discussions of Midnight's Children, and Rushdie himself has talked at length about the impact of memory in the writing of a work such as Midnight's Children. Let me also draw your attention to what Midnight's Children does not do. Midnight's Children does not provide us with an alternative to the official colonial narrative of India. The intention of this novel is not to displace the existing narratives and then to present a new story which would be seen as an alternative or as the only new possibility. While it adds to the repository of stories that are available about the nation, it does not try to privilege its telling over the others. So it also needs to be reiterated that Midnight's Children need not be read for its accuracy, and there is no need for history to be validated, as we will see in the ways in which the text gets narrated. So, what does Midnight's Children enable us to do? It reminds us that, it affirms that personal narratives and outright fictions and even flawed memory, they are all legitimate forms of history. There is no validation which is required, there is no accuracy which becomes the standard of judgment. So, here what becomes important is to accept the validity of numerous localized and personalized little or micro narratives, just like Lyotard would remind us in his seminal work. And we have already taken a look at how postmodernism is also about replacing the grand narrative with a number of localized and micro narratives. And we find Midnight's Children precisely doing that. It is replacing the predominant colonial narrative with a number of micro narratives, with a number of little histories, which are also partly enabled by flawed memory, personal narratives and sources which cannot really be validated or legitimized. We see a text like Midnight's Children making use of a number of postmodern techniques such as irony, parody, intertextuality, dark humor, etc. If you look at the intertextual references in Midnight's Children, we can find plenty of them. In fact, we find a fine mix of references to texts from the European literary tradition and also from narratives in Eastern literature. And accordingly, Midnight's Children refers to Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, Gunter Grass's Tin Drum and Foster's Passage to India, and in the same vein it also refers to the vast convoluted narratives from the Eastern literary tradition, such as Shahrazade's 1000 Nights or Ramayana, the Mahabharata, as well as the innumerable oral narratives. And the text also makes use of some of the newspaper articles. With this, now we come to take a look at Toni Morrison's Beloved and how the play of postmodernism and postcolonialism could be found in this text. Toni Morrison is a Nobel laureate. She received the Nobel Prize in 1993. She is also one of the finest writers, one of the finest recounters of feminist black experience. And in her work Beloved, one of her foremost novels, we find that it employs a typical postmodern narrative structure in which we find a seamless transition from character to character, from time to time and from location to location. So, the reader has to constantly catch up with the narrative to make sense of this non-linear narrative structure. Toni Morrison's Beloved is playing with the aspects of cultural memory. Just like Midnight's Children, this text also complicates an area of existing historical knowledge, and it tries to rewrite the history of our community, which is located at a particular historical juncture. And Toni Morrison in certain ways is also addressing the 300-year-long national amnesia about slavery. This is in the context of the American history. She is also writing this text with an intention of filling the gaps which are there in the conventional dominant historiography. We find this novel Beloved also adopting a number of postmodern narrative strategies. So, it turns the readers into witnesses rather than just observers. So, we are participating in the text process of making meaning, and the readers are also urged to share the novel's judgment on history. So, this co-participation of the reader is a very postmodern thing that the text expects from the reader. And we also find that the text gets written, the text gets constructed even through the process of reading. So, even when we have the final product, the novel Beloved, in our hands, it is only through the process of reading that the text becomes complete, because the reader is a participant, the reader is an active participant in this process of making sense of the novel. The plotline of Beloved needs to be taken a look at now. It is based on a real event which happened in Kentucky in 1956, and in which what happened was an escaped slave, Margaret Garner. She chose to kill her own daughter to save her from the suffering and degradation of being taken back into slavery. In the same way, in the novel Beloved, we find a character, Sete, who cuts her 2-year-old daughter Beloved's throat, and she also tries to kill her sons and contemplates killing the youngest daughter. All of this to escape the horrors of being taken back as a slave. This certainly is a horrific act which the novel talks about. But what makes this narrative entirely different is the way in which Morrison tries to convey a lot of other things, which is not really about the horrors of this murder, the horrors of a mother killing her daughter. Toni Morrison at some level is trying to remind the reader of the horrors of the forgotten Holocaust. Maybe for the same reason she dedicates Beloved to 60 million and more. This is a very direct reference to the horrors of Holocaust, to which the Western world was largely indifferent. And she is also trying to convey that the idea of a mother killing her own baby, it ceases to be a horrific event, because the novel at large is also forcing us to consider the brutal context that made such an act possible. So, very tactfully and through her narrative skills and through her empathetic writing, Toni Morrison is able to shift the focus away from the horrors of the act of murder per se, and then forces us to look at the context which produced such an act possible, which even prompted the mother to act in such a horrific way in the first place. And she is also exploring the myth of the paternalist system of slavery in the American South, and this is also seen as one of the most scathing critiques against the practice of slavery in the American South. And Satay's murder of Beloved, in fact the daughter, when she is killed at 2 years, she is still unnamed, and Beloved is a name given to her because the headstone erected for her later bears the name Beloved. So Satay's murder of Beloved is counterbalanced by numerous acts of violence against her and her fellow slaves by the white masters on a farm, which is ironically titled Sweet Home, and this is again in Kentucky. Toni Morrison at some level is asking us to shift our focus away from the murder of this 2-year-old daughter and focus on the numerous acts of violence which had been perpetrated by the white slave masters onto their black slaves. Toni Morrison gives us a graphic description of the horrors of slavery. Prior to her escape from the slave abode, Satay had been whipped to the point of death. She was chained up and she had to endure 2 white boys sucking mockingly at her lactating breast while the slave master looked on. Her own mother was hanged. She had to witness one of the male slaves, Sixo, being roasted alive. And even after Beloved's death, Satay is forced to have sex with her slave master, because this was in return to have the headstone engraved for her daughter. So, the horrors of slavery are being very graphically described in this novel, but the narration, the set of events are not given in a sequence. It is up to the reader to go and figure out how the sequences eventually fit in. And here also, just like in Midnight's Children, we find a tussle between fiction and truth. And it would be possible to say that in this fictional account Beloved, it is possible to say that this fictionalized slave narrative in the novel Beloved has greater truth claims than the authentic slave narratives which were published from America, because these slave narratives were authenticated and censored by white patrons, and the truth in that sense remains really contested. And the novel Beloved also presents a range of truths. It talks about discontinuous and fragmented narrative. It talks about the workings of memory. And these are perhaps some of the postmodern elements in the novel. And just like Midnight's Children, it also talks about the impossibility of having a single truth or a single history. It also privileges the micro-narratives and the many localized, personalized narratives which are available and which can eventually displace the grand narrative of slavery. The narrative of the novel Beloved brings together pieces of narrative from a variety of time periods, and the novelist, the author, does not give us any indication of where they took place or how they connect. This sort of a narration also places special demands on the reader, and it's up to the reader to eventually assemble the narrative elements into a chronological ordered sequence. So, as we have noted before, the reader becomes an active participant in the creation of this text itself. So, the reader participates in the making of the text because the protagonist, the slave Satay, cannot remember the events, and it also means that the reader needs to do it for her. We need to take on the burden of making the text by arranging the events in the chronological order. And if you look at the sequence of the events, the present of the novel is 1873, and it accesses a past which is revisited. This is between 1850 and 1855, and 1855 also happens to be the year of the death of the 2-year-old daughter, who is later named Beloved. Like Midnight's Children, memory plays a very significant role in the narration of Beloved as well. And the novel at large refuses to deal with the past events in a chronological linear sequence, and this is seen as a very appropriate as well as a deliberate strategy. The protagonist Sete is trying as hard as she can, in the novel's words, to remember as close to nothing as was safe. So it's against, so the use of memory in the novel is against this wish by the protagonist to not to remember anything from the past. And Sete is unable to do so because there are these vivid images from the past. They are of horror, of natural beauty, and this is very ironical as well, because Sete's memory is unwilling to distinguish between pain and happiness. And it is at this juncture that the reader also intervenes, because memory, we find that as it is being portrayed in the novel Beloved, memory has an agency all of its own, and we also find the elusiveness of the past, just like it happens in Midnight's Children. And this text also remains as a huge challenge to readership. Many have found it extremely difficult to read this text because it does not follow a linear sequencing of narratives. And this is also urging the reader to collectively overcome the national amnesia about slavery and also to remember it fully. Though this makes more sense in the context of the American history, it's also a very telling reminder to the readers across the world. And the text also remains a puzzle that cannot be completely solved, and this is again a very postmodernist in nature, because the idea is to not really to solve the puzzle, but to engage with a series of fragmented narratives, to engage with them in such a way that the reader also participates in this process of recreating a set of recreating a past which is forgotten or which can no longer be retrieved. And these are some of the key intertexts in the novel Beloved. Uncle Tom's Cabin and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which are also popular texts from the European tradition. And the novel also refers to Eugene Field's poem Lady Button Eyes. There are a number of biblical references right from the beginning, and there are also historical references, for example, a reference to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and a reference to the Buffalo Soldiers. And finally, as and when we begin to wind up a discussion, we make a brief reference to Ishmael Reed's novel Mumbo Jumbo, and this novel can be considered as being more postmodern than Midnight's Children or Beloved. And here we can find that it's a very interesting text which was published in 1972, and it can also be considered as very typically postmodern. The narrative is punctuated by the reproductions of historical documents such as paintings, period advertisements, photographs, song lyrics, facsimile of handwritten letter, and it also has a number of textual elements such as dramatic dialogue, epigraphs, quotations and footnotes. It explores all kinds of possibilities which are there in different literary genres. There are also visual effects being explored, such as drawings, cartoons, shaded areas and extensive capitalized or italicized passages. These are a couple of sample pages from the novel Mumbo Jumbo. We find that there is a very easy coexistence of letters and figures, and this also happens rather frequently in the novel. And many of the things about Mumbo Jumbo is very postmodernist right from the title, and there are also these interesting structures that we can find. For instance, the first chapter comes before the epigraph and the title page, and the novel also ends with this very brilliant stroke. It provides a partial bibliography which is also part of the novel, and these are certain ways in which novels such as Mumbo Jumbo very directly tells us that there are no attempts, no pretenses to any kind of originality. The novel defies the possibility of any originality and even takes it a bit forward, takes one step ahead and says that this is the bibliography just like one would provide for a research paper. So here the work is very self-referential, and it also engages with a number of genres, a number of narrative strategies, and does not pretend that it is a novel. It is a fiction and needs to, and hence need to follow up with certain conventions and certain expectations. And this is also post-colonial in a very different way, and we shall not be going into the details of this text. I hope this lecture will also encourage you to take a look at all of these texts and study them in detail. And Mumbo Jumbo is considered as a perfect postmodern postcolonialist work. This is written in the form of a comic thriller plot, and according to Brian Nichol, this is a postcolonial spin to the critique of enlightenment which drives postmodern detective fiction. And Henry Louis Gates also was all praise for this work Mumbo Jumbo, and according to him this is an exemplary postmodern one and a great black intertext. So, it would be a good idea to take a look at the novel itself to know more about how the interplay of postmodernism and postcolonialism happens in this novel Mumbo Jumbo. As and when we wrap up today's lecture, I also leave a few questions for self-study. Comment on the use of intertextual references in postcolonial texts. How do texts such as Midnight's Children and Beloved narrativize history? Identify other postmodern and postcolonial novels. I hope this lecture has been an encouragement to you to take a look at these novels and also read up more about the postmodern postcolonial fiction. So, on this note, we begin to wrap up today's session. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.